Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the 2022 governor's map based on the latest polls. We have elections in 36 states this year for governor, and these races will be crucial in determining how millions of people live across the country for the latter half of President Biden's term and also into the first 2 years of the next president's term. And so you basically have polls from every single state this year, and so we'll be going over every single one of these races, and at the end of this video, we'll have a pretty comprehensive map of what polling data is currently telling us. So we're just going to get right into it, starting off with the election in Oregon. This is the major three-way race that we have this year between Christine Drazan, Tina Kotek, and Betsy Johnson. Even though the numbers for Johnson have gone down drastically in the last few months, she is still taking up a pretty considerable share of the vote, which is preventing Tina Kotek from winning this election. If Betsy Johnson was not in the race, Tina Kotek would defeat Christine Drazan, but Democrats have not been too popular in the state over the last few years. Kate Brown, the incumbent who is no longer allowed to run for re-election, barely won her second term by 6 points in 2018, which was a very good year for Democrats. So Tina Kotek is struggling quite a bit here. She's only even in the polls against Drazan, and of course, Christine Drazan does not need a majority to win. All she needs is a plurality, and currently the polls have an even race in the state. I think the election could go both ways, but Tina Kotek still has a very slight advantage, as she is, of course, the Democrat running in a solid blue state. But Oregon, as of right now, is going to be an even race. I cannot give this state to either one party because not a single party is actually ahead. Next up in California, Gavin Newsom leads by 21% against Brian Dale. He survived a recall election just last year, winning over 60% support, and this year he's probably going to win by a very similar margin against Dale. The national environment is not going to affect this race too much. In 2018, Gavin Newsom was elected by a 24-point margin against Dan Cox. He's not going to do better this year than he did last time, but he'll still win pretty comfortably by at least 15 points. So California is going to be a solid blue state, while in the neighboring state of Nevada, the Silver State has a much more competitive election between Joe Lombardo and Steve Sisolak. Sisolak is the incumbent Democratic governor elected in 2018 by 4.1%, but this year he's facing a very tough battle for a second term against Lombardo, who is the sheriff of Clark County. Lombardo leads by 0.9% in the polls and recently took the lead just at the beginning of this month. He was behind for most of the campaign, but this last-minute surge is going to have a major impact on this race. The Nevada governorship is going to be one of the most competitive ones of the year, and Steve Sisolak right now is behind in most polls for this election, although many polls do still have the race as being completely even. But according to the polls right now, Nevada is going to be a tilt Republican state, with Joe Lombardo leading by just under 1%. And then in Idaho and Wyoming, Brad Little and Mark Gordon are going to win their re-elections. We don't have polls for these two races, but these are two of the most Republican states in the country, so they're going to be solid GOP nonetheless. However, we do have a much closer race in Arizona, where Katie Hobbs is running against Kari Lake to succeed Doug Ducey, who was reelected by 14 points in 2018. The election this year is going to be much closer, and Kari Lake right now is on track to winning. She's ahead by 2.8% in the polls, but this was not always the case. Katie Hobbs had a very strong lead for a very long time, but due to her refusal to debate her opponent, Hobbs' numbers have gone down pretty drastically in the last 2 months, and so right now it looks like Kari Lake is going to be the one to succeed Doug Ducey, as Arizona is a lean Republican state. In Colorado, Jared Polis is on track to easily winning re-election by a solid margin. He leads by 15.4% against Heidi Gonnell. He is going to outperform Joe Biden and his 13.5% margin from 2020, and also his very own margin from 2018, which was 10.6%. So the only openly gay governor in the country is going to win re-election, and according to the polls, Colorado is going to be a solid blue state. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, we do have a much closer race between Michelle Lujan Grisham and Mark Ronchetti. Lujan Grisham won by 14 points in 2018, but she has since not been that popular in her state, and so that's why this race is so close. Mark Ronchetti is a strong and moderate Republican nominee, which will make the New Mexico governorship, the election for it, a race to watch, as New Mexico is only going to be a likely Democratic state based on the polling. But in all honesty, in the end, Lujan Grisham is probably going to win by a margin less than 5 points. Next up, we have two other likely states, but they're going to go for Republicans instead. These are the elections in South Dakota and Nebraska. In South Dakota, Kristi Noem leads by 11.5% on average. She won only by 3 points in 2018, so she is going to win by a much larger margin than last time, but still, considering how solid red South Dakota is, she's not going to do that well. Donald Trump won the state by 26 points in 2020, and in 2016, it was a margin of almost 30%. So Kristi Noem, she's going to do better than last time, but she may not actually win by a solid margin over 15%. And then in Nebraska, Pete Ricketts cannot run for re-election to a third term, which means that Jim Pillen will be the one to succeed him. Pillen is the Republican nominee for this race. In the end, he is going to win by over 15 points, but right now, he only leads by 7, according to the only poll released for this race. And so South Dakota and Nebraska, even though there's a very good chance they're going to be solid Republican states, according to the latest polls, they're only going to be likely for the GOP. In Kansas, we have one of the most contentious races of the year. Laura Kelly, who won by 5 points in 2018 against Chris Kobach, is running for re-election as the Democratic governor of this solid red state, and currently she's up by 3.7% according to the polling average, but we've only seen 3 recent polls for this election. Derek Schmidt is probably going to come out on top in the end, but according to the polling right now, Laura Kelly has a very good chance at winning her re-election. In fact, the 538 forecast gives her a 61% chance at doing so. So according to the polls, Kansas is going to be a lean Democratic state, the first lean Democratic state on this map, while Oklahoma is actually only going to be a tilt state for the GOP because Kevin Stitt, who was elected in 2018, only leads by 1% against the Democratic nominee Joy Hoffmeister. Hoffmeister is a former Republican who changed parties just to run against Stitt, so Hoffmeister is a very moderate member of the Democratic Party. She's running a very strong campaign against the incumbent Republican, and the 3 latest polls all show Joy Hoffmeister leading against the governor of Oklahoma, who has been there for 4 years. Kevin Stitt is moderately popular, but he is facing a very tough battle for re-election, and so according to the polls, Oklahoma is only going to be a tilt Republican state as a result. Meanwhile, in Texas, Republicans are going to do much better. Greg Abbott is up by 8 points in polling against Beto O'Rourke. This race has always been very solid for the incumbent Republican, who is now running for a third term. Democrats are going to flip Texas at some point down the road, but it's not going to be 2022. The year is simply terrible for Democrats based on the national environment. 2020, Joe Biden did pretty well in the Lone Star State, but just 2 years later, Greg Abbott is going to defeat Beto O'Rourke probably by a double-digit margin. Abbott's been up in the polling for a very long time. Beto O'Rourke does have the largest organization in terms of volunteers to help him be elected across the country, but he is still going to come up short, and so Texas is going to be a likely Republican state, and so is Alaska, where Mike Dunleavy leads by 12.5%. He'll be the first governor of Alaska to be elected to a second term since the late 1990s and early 2000s. The last, I believe, 4 governors of the state have either resigned, lost re-election, or did not even run, and so against Les Gara, his main opponent, Mike Dunleavy, leads by a double-digit margin. And then in Hawaii, we don't have polls here, but it's going to be a very solid race for Josh Green, who is the current lieutenant governor. And now moving on to the Rust Belt, we have some pretty competitive races in the upper region of the Midwest, but in the southern region, we do have some less competitive races. So Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio are going to go to the incumbents pretty easily. In Iowa, Kim Reynolds leads by 14.7%. In Illinois, J.B. Pritzker is up by a likely margin as well, 13.5%. In the end, Reynolds is probably going to win by a solid margin, but not Pritzker. Pritzker did win by 16 points in 2018. But that was a much better year for Democrats nationwide. And then in Ohio, Mike DeWine is on track to winning by a solid margin. In fact, he leads by 19 points in the polls against Nan Whaley. DeWine is a very strong incumbent governor who did actually face a primary challenge from Jim Bernanke, who was supported by the Trump wing of the Republican Party. Mike DeWine is a much more moderate member of the GOP, but against Nan Whaley in a general election, Whaley is going to lose pretty tremendously to DeWine, making Ohio a solid red state. However, we do have a much closer election in Minnesota, where Tim Walz is running for re-election against Scott Jensen. The polls are going to overestimate Democrats here. Tim Walz is probably going to win by under 5 points. A 4 to 5% margin is much more likely, but it will still be a win for him nonetheless. Tim Walz is definitely on track to winning a second term, and is currently up by a likely margin in the polls. But a Democrat that is much less likely to win re-election is Tony Evers in Wisconsin. He is running against Tim Michels, the Republican nominee, who is a very moderate member of the GOP, just like Mike DeWine, and honestly a pretty good candidate that was chosen by the Republican Party. And so when looking at the latest polls, Tony Evers does lead in most of them, and there is still a very good chance that he does win his re-election. But Tim Michels, running as a Republican, is going to have a major advantage because no Democrat has won a governor election in Wisconsin with a Democratic president in the White House since 1962, when JFK was still in office. So Tony Evers has a very tough battle ahead of him, but there's still a good chance he does win, and according to the polls, he is ahead currently by a tilt margin. And then in Michigan, we have a close race here as well between Tudor Dixon and Gretchen Whitmer. The margin for Whitmer in the polls has been decreasing over the last few weeks. When October 1st began, Whitmer was ahead by 13 points. Now she's only up by 5. And when looking at the latest polls, Whitmer still leads in every single one of them, just not by as strong of a margin as before. The latest Trafalgar poll has Dixon within the margin of error. But overall, Gretchen Whitmer is still doing much better than she was a few months ago, because when James Craig was in the running for the Republican nomination, there's a very good chance that Whitmer was actually going to lose her re-election. She won by 9 points in 2018, and despite this race tightening up, Whitmer is still going to win. Even though she's probably not going to win by a likely margin anymore, she's probably going to win by 2 to 3%, but according to the polls, she's still ahead by at least 5. However, in Pennsylvania, Democrats are doing much better. Josh Shapiro leads by 9.5% against Doug Mastriano. He is in a very strong position despite John Fetterman losing his lead to Mehmet Oz over the last couple of days. Doug Mastriano was the worst Republican nominee for any gubernatorial race this year. He is just way too far to the right for any race in a state like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is just way too much to the center. Mastriano would be a much better candidate in a state like Idaho or Wyoming, but Pennsylvania is not it. And so despite the races in both Minnesota and Michigan getting closer, Josh Shapiro is still doing just as well as he was before in the Keystone State. And then in Maryland, we have a win for Democrats here as well. They will take back the governorship that was controlled by Republicans over the last 8 years. Larry Hogan was reelected governor of the state by 12 points in 2018, a Republican in a solid blue state in a year that was very favorable for Democrats. So Larry Hogan was a very popular governor, but he cannot run for a third term, which means that Wes Moore will be the Democrat to take back the office and defeat Dan Cox by at least 20%. Polls have him up, though, by 28 points. Maryland is going to be solid blue. Next up, in New York, Kathy Hochul leads by 7 points against Lee Zeldin. This race is also getting closer, even though Hochul is still going to win. Lee Zeldin actually led in a poll recently that I think is a very surprising news for Democrats. The Democratic Party is not doing well in the Empire State. Their mismanagement over the last couple of years is what led Hochul to this position. She is still going to win, but she is going to win by a surprisingly small margin. She was ahead still by 14 points just at the beginning of this month. The surge for Lee Zeldin has been insane, but he's still going to come out short. New York is going to retain its Democratic governor, who only took office in August of last year, succeeding Andrew Cuomo, who would have won by a solid margin this year if he had not had his scandal. And now moving on to the Northeast, we have elections that really aren't going to be that competitive, but still very interesting to go over, especially in Vermont and New Hampshire, where the Republican incumbents are going to win by solid margins for a second time in a row. In 2020, Phil Scott and Chris Sununu won by 41 and 32% margins, respectively. Governors in these two states are the only ones to be elected every 2 years, so both Scott and Sununu are now running for their fourth terms. In Vermont, Phil Scott leads by 35 points against Brenda Siegel, so that state will be solid red. And in New Hampshire, it's going to be solid red as well. Chris Sununu is up by 15.9% against Tom Sherman. Both of these races are not going to flip, despite them being states that went to Joe Biden in 2020 and also Hillary Clinton in 2016. And then in Maine, another state that Joe Biden won, but this time it's actually going to go to the Democratic Party. Janet Mills was elected by 8 points in 2018, and currently she's up by 9.6% against Paula Page in her bid for a second term. LePage is a former governor of Maine, but really not too popular, and his election wins only occurred because they were four-way races and three-way races in his re-election. LePage barely won 38% of the vote in his first election, so Janet Mills is on track to easily winning a second time, and she's not going to win by a double-digit margin, but she will win by at least 5 points, so Maine is going to be likely Democratic. And in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, Democrats are going to win all three of these races, but Massachusetts is actually going to be a flip, as Mara Healey is going to succeed Charlie Baker, who won re-election to a second term by a solid margin in 2018. So just like Maryland, after 8 years of GOP control, Republicans are going to lose the state of Massachusetts, as Mara Healey is going to take back this governorship for the Democratic Party. Massachusetts is the second most Democratic state in the country. However, in Connecticut and Rhode Island, we do have slightly closer races, as Ned Lamont only leads by 12.1% against Bob Stefanowski in Connecticut, and then in Rhode Island, Dan McKee is ahead by 11.5% against Ashley Callis. So the two Democratic incumbents are still going to win, but not by the most solid of margins, and so these are going to make the states of Connecticut and Rhode Island both likely. Now coming down to the Deep South, these are the final races that we have. I'm going to go over these first three that are going to be solid for the GOP. In Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders leads by 17 points in the polls. She is going to succeed Asa Hutchinson, who cannot run for a third term. So Arkansas is going to be solid red for Huckabee Sanders, who is actually the daughter of a former governor of the state. And then in Tennessee, we have Bill Lee on track to winning re-election. This is the first poll we've seen for this state, and Lee is up by 24%. So that's going to make Tennessee also solid red, while in Alabama, we don't actually have polls for this election, but it's still going to be a strong victory for Kay Ivey, the incumbent Republican. Next up in South Carolina, Henry McMaster is on track to winning re-election a second time. He first took office in 2017 after Nikki Haley resigned to become Trump's ambassador to the UN, and then after a victory in 2018, McMaster is now on track to winning a second time against Joe Cunningham. Joe Cunningham is running a pretty strong campaign as a Democrat in a state as red as South Carolina, but McMaster is not going to lose. These polls are fairly old because in the end, McMaster is probably going to win by at least 10 points, 15% maybe, but at least a double-digit margin for the incumbent Republican. So this will make South Carolina likely for the GOP. We have another likely race in Georgia, where Brian Kemp leads by 6.9% against Stacey Abrams. Abrams was a very strong nominee in 2018, but Brian Kemp, after 4 years in the governor's mansion, is very popular now, which will make defeating him much more difficult. Stacey Abrams did help Joe Biden, Jon Ossoff, and Ralph A. Warnock win their elections in 2020 and 2021, and is a major player in Democratic politics in the state. She will run for major office again, and she will win at some point, but it's not going to be 2022. Georgia is going to remain in the hands of the Republican Party, at least for the next 4 years. And then in Florida, we have another likely Republican state. I don't think this is too surprising. Ron DeSantis, who only won in 2018 by 0.39% against Andrew Gillum, is now on track to winning re-election by a double-digit margin against Charlie Crist, who is a former governor, a former Republican governor from 2007 until 2011. Ron DeSantis has quickly become the frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2024, and if he wants to win that nomination, he's going to have to win his re-election this year, and right now it looks like he's easily going to be able to do that. So the Sunshine State is going to be likely for the GOP, which makes all three of these final races states that Republicans are going to win pretty easily. And so this is the 2022 governor's map based on the latest polls. 22 for the Democrats, 27 for the Republicans, and one race that is even. That is the election in Oregon. There's a good chance that both parties win it, but Republicans are definitely doing much better in both Nevada and Arizona, while Democrats continue to lead in both Kansas and Wisconsin and are still on track to flipping both Maryland and Massachusetts by a solid margin. We have tightening races in the Midwest, as well as, of course, New York, but right now, the balance of power in terms of governorships isn't going to change too much. Democrats are not going to do as poorly as they did in 2014 when they only won 18 of them after 6 years of Barack Obama. In the end, it's going to be somewhere near the middle of the Democrats' performance in 2014 and 2018. And so that will be it for this video. Make sure to like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win more governorships after these elections. Subscribe to my channel to stay updated, and I will see you guys in the next video tomorrow.